somewhere beneath the island of Crete, in the darkness where torchlight cannot reach, and no map has ever held its shape for long, something breathes. It does not sleep the way you or I sleep, curled, peaceful, dreaming of gentle things. It paces, slowly at first, its great hooves finding the familiar grooves worn into ancient stone over years of endless circling, then faster. Then with a sound, somewhere between a man's frustrated sigh and a bull's low resonant thunder, it stops, it listens, and somewhere far above, in the warm Mediterranean sun, a ship has just arrived from Athens. This is where our story begins, not with a hero, not yet. First, we must understand the thing that made a hero necessary, the Minotaur. The name itself is almost too clean for what the creature was. In Greek, Minotauros, the bull of Minos, or more literally, the bull of King Minos of Crete. But names rarely capture monsters. The Minotaur was born of a curse, carried in the womb of a queen, and raised in a prison that a god-touched architect designed specifically so that nothing, and no one, could ever leave it. Half man, half bull. The body of a powerful, broad-shouldered human male, and set atop it, that enormous bovine head, wide nostrils, dark and ancient eyes, and two curving horns that could pin a man to a wall with a single unhurried movement. He stood, by most ancient accounts, of tremendous size. Not a creature you could outrun in an open field, and certainly not one you could overpower with bare hands. His strength was the strength of cattle amplified into something that walked upright and thought, partially, imperfectly, agonizingly, like a man. Ancient vase paintings show him mid-charge, muscles carved in black and red clay, moving with a terrible momentum. Later, Roman mosaics slow him down somewhat, give him a brooding stillness. But both traditions agree on the essential quality. This was a being of terrifying physical capability, one that had already killed every tribute, victim sent into the labyrinth before the day Theseus arrived. And those victims were no accident. Every 9 years, some traditions say every year, 14 young Athenians were selected, 7 young men, 7 young women, sent by ship across the Aegean, sent as tribute to King Minos, payment for a war Athens had lost, and a debt that carried the bitterest of interest rates. They would be walked to the entrance of the labyrinth. The door would close behind them. And in the twisting dark, the Minotaur would find them one by one, in whatever order the corridors allowed. That labyrinth, the Daedalus, deserves a moment of its own. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Because the genius of the Minotaur's myth is not only the creature, but the architecture of his captivity. Daedalus, that brilliant, complicated craftsman of myth, built it on the orders of Minos, a structure so intricate, so recursively folded upon itself, that even its builder needed a thread to find his way out once he had finished it. Imagine a building that thinks, that redirects, that leads you with almost polite confidence down passages that dead end, around corners that bring you to where you started, deeper into its logic until the darkness feels less like an absence of light and more like a presence of its own. The labyrinth was not just a prison, it was a riddle, and the Minotaur was its only answer. Then came Theseus, Prince of Athens, son of the king, a young man who had already proven himself in ways the myths record with characteristic understatement. He volunteered. He chose to go. His father Aegeus made him promise, if he survived, change the ship's sails from black to white on the return voyage, so that he, watching from the cliffs, would know his son lived. It is the detail of a father who expected the worst and hoped, quietly, for the impossible. In Crete, Theseus met Ariadne, daughter of Minos, who looked at this brave Athenian and made a decision that would echo across millennia. She gave him a ball of thread, simple, elegant, devastating in its practicality. He tied one end to the entrance, unwound it as he walked, and followed it home after doing what no one before him had done, finding the Minotaur in the deepest chamber of the labyrinth and killing him there, in the dark, with his hands. No sword is mentioned in the oldest versions of the myth. Only Theseus, only the Minotaur, only the dark. The Minotaur died alone, as he had always lived, in the center of a maze not of his making, prisoner to a nature he could not have chosen. And it is that detail, perhaps more than any other, that has kept this myth alive across 3,000 years of retellings. Because the Minotaur is not simply a monster to be defeated. He is something stranger and more uncomfortable. He is what happens when forces beyond anyone's control collide. Divine punishment, human ambition, and an innocent creature who bore all the consequences of both. In the segments ahead, we will move slowly through this myth. We will walk the shores of Bronze Age Crete and understand the world that gave it birth. We will descend, carefully, into the architecture of the labyrinth. We will sit with the creature himself, his origins, his solitude, his nature. We will follow Theseus not as a triumphant hero, but as a complicated young man making a desperate choice. And we will trace how the Minotaur's shadow has fallen across art, literature, and the human imagination for 30 centuries, and has not lifted yet. There is no rush. The labyrinth has no clocks. Let us begin. Somewhere around 1700 BCE, on an island sitting at the crossroads of 3 continents, a civilization reached its peak so quietly and so completely that the rest of the ancient world could only watch and wonder. Crete, roughly 260 kilometers long, narrow and mountainous at its spine, dropping into the warm blue water of the Mediterranean on every side. It is, even today, a place that asks nothing hurried of you. The light arrives golden and stays golden. The mountains hold the island's interior like cupped hands. And in the Bronze Age, at a time when much of Europe was still organized around small tribal settlements and subsistence farming, this island was home to something extraordinary. We call them the Minoans. They did not call themselves that. We borrowed the name from the mythical king at the center of our story, Minos, and applied it backward onto a people who had flourished and faded long before the Greeks arrived to tell tales about them. It was the British archaeologist Arthur Evans who first excavated the great palace site at Knossos in the early 20th century, and who stood in those ruins and recognized, slowly and with some astonishment, that he was looking at something no one had been prepared for. Paved roads, indoor plumbing, sophisticated drainage systems, frescoes of extraordinary delicacy, young men leaping over charging bulls, women in elaborate tiered dresses, blue monkeys among papyrus flowers, painted in colors that had survived 3,500 years of burial and still held their warmth. The Minoans built palaces that were not merely palaces. Knossos, the largest and most important of them, sprawled across an area of roughly 22,000 square meters. It had multiple stories, storerooms that could hold hundreds of large ceramic jars, pithoi, each one brimming with olive oil, wine, or grain. It had a grand staircase. It had a throne room, small and surprisingly intimate, with a gypsum seat that still sits in its original position today if you visit the site, flanked by painted griffins. It had workshops and shrines, and a system of record-keeping using a script that we have partially, but only partially, decoded, called Linear B. This is important context for our story, because the Minotaur myth did not arise in a vacuum of pure imagination. It arose from a real place, a real palace, and a real cultural encounter between the Minoans and the mainland Greeks who would eventually arrive on their shores. When the Greeks looked at Knossos, its warren of corridors, its ritual significance, its bull iconography everywhere, on frescoes and ceramics and carved stone seals, they saw the raw material for a myth, a labyrinthine palace, a powerful king, sacred bulls. A story began to assemble itself, the way stories always do, from the residue of history that memory cannot quite process any other way. The bull, in particular, deserves our attention here. Across Minoan Crete, the bull was sacred in a way that no single English word adequately captures. Bull horns, the symbol known as the horns of consecration, appear at the tops of walls, on altars, in religious contexts throughout the archaeological record. The great sport, if we can call it that, of bull leaping, depicted in some of the most famous frescoes from the palace, involved athletes, male and female, apparently grasping the horns of a charging bull and vaulting over its back in a display of courage and religious devotion that combined the athletic and the spiritual into a single extraordinary act. No one has entirely agreed on how bull leaping worked in practice. Some scholars believe the fresco images are stylized and ritual rather than literal. Others have attempted to physically reconstruct the act and found it dangerous, possible, and genuinely breathtaking. What is not debated is what the bull meant: power, divinity, the raw force of the natural world made present in an arena where humans could demonstrate their willingness to meet it head-on, to grab it by the horns. And here, that phrase is not metaphorical, and move with it rather than against it. When the Greeks inherited this tradition through contact, trade, and eventually conquest, the bull's sacred charge absorbed into their own mythology in an altered form. Poseidon, god of the sea, becomes the bull's divine sponsor. The bull becomes an instrument of divine punishment, and the creature born from that punishment, part bull, part man, carries within its very body the central spiritual tension of the Minoan world, the threshold between the human and the animal, the civilized and the wild, the order a palace represents, and the chaos that always waits just beyond its walls. We should pause, too, on what kind of world Theseus would have sailed into when he crossed the Aegean toward Crete. By the period the myths seem to reflect, roughly 1000 to 1000 BCE, the Minoan civilization was already in decline. The palace of Knossos had, by that point, come under Mycenaean Greek control, its records being kept in Greek rather than the earlier Minoan scripts. But the island's reputation, its cultural weight, its sheer accumulated power and strangeness in the Greek imagination, all of that persisted. Crete was the old world, the wealthy world, the world that had rules older than anyone could remember, and gods that did not always respond to prayer in expected ways. Athens, by contrast, was a newer city, a rising power, a place still finding the shape of itself. The dynamic between Athens and Crete in the Theseus myth is not simply political, tribute paid by the weak to the strong. It is civilizational, young, aggressive, democratic in its early stirrings. Athens sending its children to this ancient island and its ancient king and his ancient monster, and sending, finally, a young man who would refuse to accept that the terms of the arrangement were permanent. The sea crossing itself would have been no small thing. The Aegean in the Bronze Age was well traveled. The Minoans were accomplished sailors and traders, their goods found as far afield as Egypt and the Near East. But it was also genuinely dangerous. Open water, unpredictable winds, the kind of journey that gave you time to think, time to reckon with what waited at the other end of the passage. Ancient sailors navigated by stars and coastlines, reading the water with a familiarity we have largely lost. They made offerings to Poseidon before departure. They read the flight patterns of birds. They understood the sea as a living thing with preferences and moods, and they adjusted accordingly. Theseus would have arrived on Crete not as a conqueror, but as a prisoner, one of 14, a tribute youth, notable perhaps for his bearing, his obvious confidence, the quality of stillness he would have carried that set him apart from those around him, but a prisoner nonetheless. And King Minos, who in the myth is not simply a villain but a king of genuine authority, grieving his own dead son for whose death Athens bore responsibility, dispensing a punishment that was, by the logic of the ancient world, not without justification, would have looked at these 14 young Athenians and seen them as the working of proper order, of debt repaid. That Ariadne did not see them that way, that she looked at Theseus specifically and felt something entirely different working in her, is one of the myth's great hinges. And we will return to her, as she deserves her own careful attention. But what matters here, in this segment, is the world that shaped both of them, a world in which palaces were labyrinths, and labyrinths were palaces, in which the sacred and the monstrous shared a corridor, in which the sea connected everything and separated everything in equal measure, in which a bull was a god's argument made flesh, and a half-bull creature locked beneath a great palace was not simply a story someone invented one afternoon. It was the distilled memory of a civilization. Its power, its strangeness, its sacred cruelty, and its ultimate fragility, pressing itself into narrative so that it would not be forgotten. The Minoans are gone. Their script is partially unread. Their religion is largely reconstructed from images rather than texts. Their cities have been absorbed by the earth and by time. But the myth persists. The Minotaur persists, pacing his stone corridors in the imagination of every generation that has encountered the story, still breathing in the dark, still waiting at the center of the maze. And we are still, in some sense, still following the thread. There is a particular kind of hubris that the ancient Greeks understood better than perhaps any civilization before or since. Not the loud, obvious arrogance of a man who declares himself a god at a banquet and expects applause. Something quieter than that. More dangerous, the hubris of a man who receives a gift of extraordinary grace and thinks, just for a moment, just long enough to make the fatal calculation, that he might keep it for himself, that the divine might not notice, that the terms of the arrangement could be quietly renegotiated in his favor. King Minos of Crete was that man, and what followed from his moment of quiet, reasonable-seeming greed was the Minotaur. But let us not begin with the king. Let us begin, as the Greeks always began, with the god. Poseidon, brother of Zeus, lord of the seas, shaker of the earth. Among the Olympians, he is one of the most elemental. Not a god of civilization or craft or wisdom, but of the raw, indifferent forces that precede all of those things. The sea does not care about your city. The earthquake does not pause for your prayers. Poseidon governs a domain that was ancient before humanity arrived and will persist long after it departs. He is worshipped with fear as much as with devotion. And his favor, when it comes, arrives in the form of things that are beautiful and overwhelming in equal measure. It was to Poseidon that Minos prayed when he needed to demonstrate that his claim to the throne of Crete was legitimate. He had rivals. He had brothers who contested his right to rule, and so Minos made the kind of bargain that mythology is built from. He asked the god for a sign. A white bull would rise from the sea, he promised, and he would sacrifice it immediately upon the altar as proof of divine favor, as a gift returned to its giver. As the proper closing of a sacred transaction, the sea opened. The bull emerged. Even by the standards of ancient description, it was remarkable. White as sea foam, perfectly formed, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that has never needed to be afraid of anything. The Cretans, watching from the shore, would have understood immediately what they were seeing. This was not simply an animal. This was divinity made visible, made animal, made temporarily present in the world, so that the correct ritual could be performed, and the proper relationship between king and god could be established. Minos looked at the bull, and he kept it. The precise accounting of his reasoning varies depending on which ancient source you read. Perhaps he told himself the sacrifice could be delayed. Perhaps he substituted another bull, a lesser animal, a fine one by ordinary standards, but ordinary nonetheless, and hoped the substitution would pass unnoticed. Perhaps he simply wanted it. The bull was extraordinary, and extraordinary things have a way of making possession feel like destiny rather than theft. Whatever the internal logic, the external result was the same. The white bull lived. It joined his herds. The god was not given what the god was owed. Poseidon noticed. Divine punishment in Greek mythology rarely arrives as lightning from a clear sky. It tends to be more precise than that, more thematic. The punishment fits the nature of the transgression, the way a river fits its banks, not by accident, but by the logic of accumulated force finding the path of least resistance. Minos had kept something he should have surrendered. He had confused the beautiful with the possessible. He had placed his own desire between himself and the proper order of sacred obligation. So Poseidon arranged that desire itself would be the instrument of ruin. The god turned his attention to Pasiphae, wife of Minos, queen of Crete, a figure of considerable dignity and, in most accounts, no culpability whatsoever in what was about to happen to her. She was the daughter of Helios, the sun god, which gives her a lineage of brightness, of clarity, of things seen plainly in the light. What Poseidon did to her was the opposite of all of that. He caused her to fall in love. If love is even the right word for a divinely inflicted compulsion, with the white bull. The myth does not dwell on this as tragedy, not in its oldest tellings. Greek mythology is often dispassionate about suffering at this level of divine mechanics, the way weather reports are dispassionate about storms. Something happened. Here are the conditions that caused it. Here is what followed. The moral weight is there if you choose to carry it, but the narrative itself does not insist you stop and grieve. We, at this distance, may feel differently. A queen, afflicted through no fault of her own, bearing the consequences of her husband's pride. There is something in that arrangement that the Greeks noted, and that we cannot entirely let pass without acknowledgement. It was Daedalus who solved the problem that Poseidon's curse created. That brilliant, morally flexible craftsman, a figure who will return to us when we consider the Labyrinth, constructed for Pasiphae, a hollow wooden cow, covered in real hide, on wheels, designed to be positioned in the fields where the white bull grazed. The myth records this detail with a specificity that still manages to unsettle, the way precise technical description of something wrong always unsettles more than vague suggestion would. From this union, divine punishment, royal shame, and a craftsman's terrible ingenuity all converging at once, the Minotaur was conceived. Pasiphae carried the child to term, and when the creature was born, when the Queen of Crete looked at what had come from her body, that recognizably human form topped with the head of a bull, nursing with a hunger that was somehow more animal than infant, she did not abandon it. She named him Asterion, Star Child, a name of brightness for a creature born into the darkest of circumstances. Some tellings suggest she nursed him herself, at least initially. Whatever the domestic arrangements of those early months, the ancient sources preserve in the name Asterion something that the more famous name, Minotaur, erases entirely: the suggestion of a mother's love, or at least a mother's attempt at love, in the face of something unprecedented and impossible. It is worth sitting with that name for a moment. Asterion, because everything that comes after, the labyrinth, the tribute, the darkness, the death, tends to bury it. We call him the Minotaur, and we see a monster. We call him Asterion, and we see something more complicated. A child born into a situation entirely of others' making, carrying in his divided body the evidence of his father's pride, his mother's affliction, and his divine grandfather's wrath. He did not choose any of it. He did not choose what he was, where he was born, or the particular combination of man and bull that made it impossible for him to live as either. As Asterion grew, the practical problem he represented became impossible to ignore. He was large. He was strong in ways that the ordinary architecture of a palace cannot easily contain, and he was, by the ancient accounts, dangerous. His behavior becoming more erratic and more violent as the animal nature of his bull mind expressed itself in a body of tremendous physical power. Whether this violence was intrinsic to his nature or was the product of his circumstances, isolation, incomprehension, an environment that offered no possibility of companionship or understanding, is a question the myth leaves open, and one that later writers and artists have returned to obsessively for precisely that reason. Minos consulted the oracle at Delphi. The oracle advised the construction of a prison, not a cage. The Minotaur was too powerful for simple confinement, but something more total, a structure from which escape was architecturally impossible. And so, Daedalus was commissioned once again, the same craftsman who had made the problem worse, now tasked with containing its consequences. He designed the Labyrinth. The creature was placed at its center. The entrance was sealed, and Minos, having now managed to imprison the most visible evidence of his transgression, turned his attention to the problem of feeding it. Here, the myth makes its sharpest turn, because the Minotaur, by most accounts, was not content with grain or livestock. He required human flesh. Whether this was a true feature of his biology, a metaphor for the monstrousness of the situation, or simply a narrative escalation that suited the Greek sense of what a proper monster required, the effect in the story is the same. The creature needed to be fed, and the only available source of that feeding was the political leverage Minos happened to possess over Athens. Athens had killed Minos' son Androgeos. That story has its own complications, involving jealousy and athletic competitions and the particular brutality that fame can provoke in those who feel overshadowed by it. Minos had gone to war. Athens eventually had yielded, and the tribute, 14 young Athenians, 7 of each sex, every 9 years, was the price of peace and the Minotaur's dinner in a single arrangement. Every 9 years, the black-sailed ship crossed the Aegean. Every 9 years, the door of the Labyrinth opened and closed. Every 9 years, Crete demonstrated to Athens and to the wider Greek world what power looked like when it was fully exercised. Not merely the power to defeat an enemy in battle, but the power to reach into that enemy's future and take from it, regularly and deliberately, its most promising young lives. It is the cruelty of a bureaucracy rather than a battlefield. Scheduled, inevitable, performed at intervals long enough that each generation of Athenians could almost, but not quite, persuade themselves that perhaps this time the ship would not come. It always came, until the year a prince named Theseus decided that he would be on it. There is a question that architects and philosophers have returned to independently across many centuries, and it goes something like this. Can a building have a moral character? Not the people inside it, not the purposes to which it is put. The building itself, its corridors, its proportions, its relationship between light and dark, between openness and enclosure, can stone and geometry, arranged with sufficient intention, become something that acts upon the human mind, not merely as shelter, but as argument. The Labyrinth says yes, not because it is the oldest such building, or the largest, or the most technically sophisticated, but because no structure in the history of human imagination, real or mythological, has so completely fused its physical form with its psychological purpose. The Labyrinth was not a place that happened to be confusing. Confusion was its architecture. Disorientation was its load-bearing wall. The The point was not to hold the Minotaur the way a cage holds an animal, with bars, with locks, with the brute simplicity of a barrier between inside and outside. The point was to make inside and outside meaningless categories, to create a space in which the very concept of a way out ceased to be available, not because the exits were locked, but because the mind, moving through the corridors, could no longer hold the shape of the place it was moving through. Daedalus understood this, which tells us something important about Daedalus. He arrives in the myth as a given, a craftsman of divine skill, already present at the court of Minos, already trusted, already complicit. His full story, told across many sources and reassembled here, is one of the most extraordinary in all of Greek mythology, and we will encounter him again when we follow Theseus into the maze. But for now, what matters is the specific nature of his genius and the specific problem he was asked to solve. The problem was unprecedented. Minos needed to contain a creature that was stronger than a man, more unpredictable than an animal, and in some sense more pitiable than either. Because the Minotaur, for all his violence, for all his terrible physical capacity, did not appear to understand what he was. He could not be reasoned with, because his bull mind did not organize the world through reason. He could not be appealed to, because nothing in the myth suggests he had access to the kind of interiority that makes appeal possible. He could be fed, he could be contained, and that was the full scope of what Minos required. Daedalus solved this with space, with a building so internally complex that its own geometry became the lock, the Greek word sometimes associated with the structure. And here scholars are careful, because the etymology is genuinely contested, may derive from the pre-Greek word labris, the double-headed axe that was the sacred symbol of Minoan Crete, appearing everywhere in the archaeological record of Knossos and the other palace sites. If so, the labyrinth is, literally, the house of the double axe. A palace and a prison sharing a name drawn from a symbol of divine power. The building was, from its very etymology, a religious structure as much as a practical one. And this is where the archaeology becomes quietly thrilling, because Knossos, the actual excavated palace at the heart of Minoan Crete, is, whatever else it is, genuinely labyrinthine. Not in a designed, intentional way that matches the myth precisely, but in the way of a structure that grew organically across centuries, adding wings and storerooms and corridors as need and power required, until the resulting complex is something that even experienced archaeologists navigate carefully with site maps. Over 1,000 rooms, by some estimates. Multiple levels connected by staircases that do not always go where you expect them to. Corridors that turn and narrow and open into spaces whose original purpose has been debated for 100 years. Light wells, vertical shafts cut through multiple floors to bring daylight into interior rooms, that give the palace a quality of illumination both beautiful and disorienting. Light arriving from above in columns, falling on painted walls in a way that shifts the apparent depth of a room entirely. When the Greeks arrived on Crete, and walked through Knossos, or its ruins, depending on the period, they were walking through something they had no category for. No mainland Greek palace of the period approached this complexity. The natural response of an imagination encountering something it cannot classify is to reach for story, and the story that Knossos demanded, with its bull frescoes and its winding passages and its atmosphere of ancient self-contained power, was the story of a maze, and at the center of every maze, by the oldest logic of narrative, something waits. Let us walk the labyrinth, not its archaeological reality, but its mythological one. Together, slowly, you enter through a single door. This much the myth is consistent on. There is a way in, and it is the same as the way out, which is why Ariadne's thread works as a solution. Behind you, the door closes, and the sound it makes is not a slam but something worse, a slow, heavy settling, stone finding stone. The particular finality of a mechanism designed by a man who understood that the people entering through this door were not intended to use it again. The first corridor is wide enough. This is deliberate. The labyrinth does not announce itself as a trap. It offers space, reasonable dimensions, the suggestion that navigation might be straightforward. You walk forward. The corridor bends, not sharply, but with the gentle, accommodating curve of a path that seems to be leading somewhere. You follow it. It divides, left or right, and nothing distinguishes one from the other. No light source to orient by, no sound, except the sound you carry with you, your own footsteps returning from stone walls in ways that gradually stop matching your expectations. You choose. You walk. The passage narrows slightly and then widens, opens into a small chamber, round perhaps, with doorways on three sides. And suddenly the choice is threefold, and you have lost the particular quality of certainty that told you, until this moment, roughly which direction you had come from. You are not yet afraid, but you are no longer confident, and confidence in a labyrinth is the only compass that works. This continues. The Greek imagination, in its various tellings, does not give us a map of the labyrinth because a map would defeat the myth. What it gives us instead is the emotional texture of moving through it, the gradual replacement of orientation with something more animal, more instinctive. The labyrinth does not disorient you all at once. It does it slowly, turn by turn, choice by choice, until the disorientation is so complete that you cannot remember what orientation felt like, the way a person kept long in darkness forgets, at some cellular level, what they are waiting for when they wait for light. And then, from somewhere in that dark, not close, but not far enough, you hear it, the breathing, the slow circling hooves, the low sound that is neither quite animal nor quite human, and is therefore more frightening than either could be alone. The Minotaur does not hunt the way a predator hunts in open ground. He does not need to. The labyrinth hunts for him. It delivers his food to the place where he waits, confused and exhausted, and stripped of every advantage except youth. He simply has to be present at the center. The maze does the rest. This is, when you examine it, a profound and somewhat merciless metaphor, and the Greeks, who were extraordinarily deliberate about the metaphors embedded in their myths, would have recognized it immediately. The labyrinth is any system, political, psychological, bureaucratic, divine, that operates not through overt force, but through complexity, that defeats you not by being stronger than you, but by being more confusing. That takes your intelligence, your capacity for decision-making, the very faculties you would normally rely on to survive a dangerous situation, and turns them against you by giving them too many options and too little information. Tyrants have always understood this principle, even when they could not have articulated it in those terms. The truly effective prison is not the one with the thickest walls. It is the one in which the prisoner can move freely, but can never find the exit, and eventually stops believing the exit exists. The labyrinth is mythology's perfect image of that kind of power, and it is no accident that it was commissioned by a king. Daedalus, for his part, knew exactly what he had built. The myth makes this explicit in the most uncomfortable possible way, when Theseus needed help escaping. It was Daedalus who told Ariadne about the thread. The architect of the prison provided the key to it, quietly, at a remove, through an intermediary. Whether this was conscience, or professional pride in the problem's elegant solution, or simply the behavior of a man who had been too long in a king's service and had begun to quietly undermine it. The myth does not say. It only records that he knew how to undo what he had made, and chose, at the critical moment, to share that knowledge. There is something almost tender in that detail. a builder who loved his creation enough to let someone survive it. The labyrinth still stands, in the way that mythological structures stand, not in stone but in imagination, which is the more durable material. Psychologists have borrowed its image for the architecture of trauma. Philosophers have used it for the structure of certain kinds of reasoning that fold back on themselves. Writers from Ovid to Borges to Kazantzakis have walked its corridors in prose and found new rooms each time. It has become, over 3 millennia, not just a setting but a language, a way of describing any situation in which the complexity of the container is itself the danger. Daedalus built it for a king who needed to hide his shame. He built it for a creature who had no other home. He built it, though he could not have known this, for every person who has ever felt the particular dread of moving through a system too large and too intricate to understand, toward a center they cannot see, guided by nothing but the thinning thread of whatever hope they carried in with them. He did not have to go. That is the first thing to understand about Theseus, and perhaps the most important. He was not selected. He was not condemned. He was not tricked or manipulated or placed on the black-sailed ship by any force outside his own will. He was the son of Aegeus, king of Athens, which meant, by every convention of the ancient world, that he was precisely the kind of person the tribute was designed to spare. Kings do not send their heirs into labyrinths. Heirs do not volunteer for labyrinths. The entire logic of hereditary power depends on the protection of the next generation from exactly this kind of terminal uncertainty. Theseus walked to his father and told him he was going. The myth records Aegeus's response as grief. Immediate, total. The grief of a man who has already begun calculating the shape of his life after the loss. He had found Theseus late. The story of how the young prince came to Athens from his mother's home in Troezen, lifting the great stone under which his father had left a sword and sandals years before, as a kind of paternal message in a bottle. That story speaks to a relationship only recently established, still finding its footing, not yet settled into the comfortable permanence that fathers and sons sometimes achieve if they are given enough time. Aegeus had not been given enough time, and now his son was proposing to take himself across the Aegean to Crete, to walk into a maze, and to kill a monster that had not yet, in the collective memory of Athens, failed to kill everyone sent to meet it. "The black sails on the ship," Aegeus said. "If you live, when you return, change them to white, so I can know, watching from the cliff, before the ship has even made the harbor, so I can know early, and begin the celebration that much sooner." It is a request so practical and so suffused with barely controlled hope that it is almost unbearable to read, knowing, as we do, how the story ends. Theseus agreed. The ship departed. The sails were black. What kind of man was he? The myths give us a Theseus who is emphatically not the polished, divinely favored archetype of a hero like Achilles or Perseus. He is grittier than that, more interested in justice than glory, though he is not always consistent about the distinction. In the broader cycle of his myths, which extend far beyond the Minotaur story, he is a founder, a lawgiver, a man who consolidates the scattered villages of Attica into a unified Athens. He is also impulsive, capable of serious moral failure, haunted by the consequences of decisions made too quickly or held to pass their natural end. He is, in other words, recognizably human, in a way that the more burnished heroes are not. And this humanity, this quality of being clearly capable of error, even while clearly capable of extraordinary courage, is precisely what the labyrinth requires. A perfect hero does not need a thread. He navigates by divine instinct, kills the monster, and exits with the serenity of a man who never doubted the outcome. Theseus needs the thread. He is brave enough to go in, and wise enough to know that bravery alone will not bring him out. That wisdom is Ariadne's gift to him. But we should be careful about how we frame that. The thread is practical. It is the solution to the architectural problem that the labyrinth presents. What Ariadne gives him that is more than practical, more than a ball of string and a whispered set of instructions, is the belief that the attempt is survivable. That someone who knows the labyrinth from the outside, who has lived in proximity to it, who understands something of its maker's mind, has looked at him specifically and decided that he is the person who can do this. That is not a small gift. That is the kind of gift that changes the interior quality of courage from something performed against fear to something grounded in possibility. Ariadne herself demands our attention because the myth has not always given it to her generously. She is the daughter of Minos, princess of Crete, granddaughter of the sun. She sees Theseus arrive among the tribute youths and makes a decision that is, let us be clear about this, an act of political treason, familial betrayal, and profound personal risk all at once. She is not helping a friend. She is not acting from a position of safety. She is the daughter of the man who built the labyrinth, helping a prisoner dismantle everything the labyrinth was designed to accomplish, in direct defiance of her father's most consequential political arrangement. Why? The oldest versions of the myth say simply that she loved him. Later writers complicate this, suggesting divine interference, Aphrodite's influence, or Eros making the usual targeted havoc of young hearts at inconvenient moments. But even taking the simplest version at face value, what Ariadne does is not the act of a passive girl swept up in romance. She acts with precision and with knowledge. She goes to Daedalus, or, in some versions, already possesses the information, and obtains the specific technical solution to the labyrinth's central problem. She gives Theseus the thread. She instructs him to tie it at the entrance and to follow it back. She waits. The waiting is the part the myth rushes past, but that we should linger over. She waits through a night in which, for all she knows, the man she has just committed treason for is already dead at the center of the maze. She has no way of knowing. The labyrinth offers no news of its interior. She simply holds, in the silence of the Cretan night, the knowledge of what she has done, and the uncertainty of whether it has accomplished anything. And she does not run. She stays at the entrance, and she waits. Theseus unspools the thread as he walks. The myth does not give us the interior of that walk in any detailed way. The ancient sources are interested in the outcome, not the experience. But imagination and the logic of the labyrinth itself fill in something. He would have moved carefully. The thread as anchor, as constant, as the one fixed point in a space deliberately designed to dissolve fixed points. Every choice at every division of the corridor made slightly less paralyzing by the knowledge that the thread does not lie, that it holds one true line through the confusion back to the world outside. And then he finds him, Asterion, the Minotaur. At the center of everything, in the deepest chamber, in the dark. The oldest accounts of the confrontation are spare to the point of austerity. There is no lengthy battle described in the heroic tradition of Greek epic poetry. There is no catalogue of wounds and counters and divine interventions. The two meet. Theseus kills the Minotaur. The how of it, bare hands in most versions, no weapon mentioned, occasionally a sword or a club depending on the telling, is less important to the myth than the simple, enormous fact of it. The thing that had never been survived was survived. The thing that had never been killed was killed. But here is what the myth preserves that the bare summary does not. In several ancient versions, the Minotaur is found asleep. Theseus comes upon him not mid-charge, not in the terrifying posture of the vase paintings, but at rest, dormant, curled, insofar as a creature of that size and configuration can curl, in the only home it has ever known. There is a particular quality of sadness in that image that the Greeks clearly felt, because they kept it across multiple tellings, kept returning to the detail of the sleeping creature and the hero standing over it in the dark. Whatever the Minotaur was, whatever it had done to the tribute sent before Theseus, it was not, in that moment, a raging monster. It was something more uncomfortable than a raging monster. It was something that slept. Theseus killed it nonetheless. He had to. The logic of the tribute, of Athens, of the 14 young people who had sailed with him and who were waiting somewhere in the outer corridors of the Labyrinth, all of it required that he kill it. But the myth's insistence on the sleeping detail suggests an awareness, in the Greeks who told and retold this story, that heroism and tragedy are not always separable categories, that the act which saves one creature can simultaneously be the act that ends another, that the monster and the victim can, in certain terrible circumstances, be the same thing. He followed the thread back. He found the entrance. He found Ariadne. He gathered the surviving tributes. All 14 had been kept alive, awaiting the labyrinth, not yet sent in. And they moved through the night to the harbor. They cut the Cretan ship's rudders so the pursuit would be slow. They sailed north. Behind them, Knossos woke to the absence of its princess and the silence at the center of its maze. Ahead of them, across open water, Athens waited with a king standing on a cliff, watching the horizon for a change in the color of the sails. The sails were not changed. Whether Theseus forgot, overwhelmed by the grief of what had to be left behind, for Ariadne's story takes its own dark turn on the island of Naxos, or whether something else intervened, the myth does not resolve cleanly. Aegeus saw black sails, and the cliff, and the sea below it, completed the rest. Theseus arrived in Athens to find that his victory had already cost him the father he had crossed the Aegean to return to. The thread had brought him home. Home, it turned out, was not what he had left. Monsters, as a rule, do not survive their myths. They are defeated, dissolved, explained away by the advancing light of reason and scholarship, and the general human preference for a world that makes consistent sense. The Gorgon becomes a metaphor. The Cyclops becomes a cautionary tale about hospitality. The Sphinx becomes a riddle with a known answer. And once the answer is known, the Sphinx throws herself from the cliff, and that is the end of her. The Minotaur did not do this. 3,000 years after the myth first cohered into the form we recognize, Asterion is still pacing, still present, still arriving, reliably and with apparently inexhaustible vitality, in the art and literature and cultural imagination of every generation that has encountered his story, and found, to its own mild surprise, that it was not finished with him yet. He has appeared in Roman mosaic, Renaissance painting, modernist sculpture, 20th century poetry, contemporary film, graphic novels, video games, and architectural theory. He has been a monster, a victim, a symbol of otherness, a figure of tragic dignity, and occasionally something close to a tragic hero. He is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most durable, imaginative creations in the history of human storytelling. The question worth asking, slowly and without rushing toward an easy answer, is why? The Romans inherited him enthusiastically, as they inherited most things. Greek, with appetite, with genuine admiration, and with a certain talent for decoration that expressed itself in the extraordinary tradition of labyrinth mosaics found across the Roman world. From Britain to North Africa to the eastern provinces, Roman floor mosaics depicting the labyrinth and the Minotaur have been excavated in quantities that suggest not merely familiarity with the myth, but something closer to obsession. They appear in private homes, in public baths, in villas of the wealthy and administrative buildings of the powerful. The labyrinth, rendered in geometric tilework of breathtaking intricacy, with the Minotaur at its center, and Theseus advancing with his sword. This image was, for several centuries, one of the most commonly reproduced visual narratives in the ancient world. Ovid gave the story some of its most elegant Latin in the Metamorphoses, dwelling on the shame of Pasiphae with characteristic precision, and on the craftsman's genius with undisguised admiration. Virgil placed Daedalus's own grief for his son Icarus who would later fall from the sky, in the decorative program of a temple door, and put the Minotaur among the most terrible sights awaiting the newly dead. The Romans understood the myth as simultaneously a story of transgression, of punishment, and of the particular heroism required to move through a world in which powerful forces arrange terrible things and ordinary people must find their way regardless. Then came Dante, in the 14th century, constructing his great architecture of the afterlife. Dante placed the Minotaur as the guardian of the seventh circle of hell, the circle of violence, where he rages on a broken cliff, biting himself in frustrated fury at the approach of the pilgrim. It is a brief appearance, only a few lines, but its placement is enormously significant. The Minotaur in Dante is the emblem of violence without reason, a force entirely divorced from intelligence or mercy. He is, in that tradition, pure idea, all appetite and rage, no reflection. The image would influence the Western conception of the creature for centuries, hardening him into something less ambiguous, more straightforwardly monstrous than the older Greek versions had allowed. And then Picasso arrived and broke him open again. Between 1933 and 1937, Pablo Picasso returned to the Minotaur with an intensity that suggests genuine obsession rather than artistic exercise. The Vollard suite of etchings, produced across those years, contains some of the most remarkable Minotaur imagery in the entire tradition. The creature drinking wine in a sculptor's studio, reclining among women, blind, and being led by a small girl with a dove, suffering, dreaming, dying in the arena. Picasso's Minotaur is neither purely monstrous nor purely sympathetic. He is erotic and violent and tender and doomed, often within the same image. He is, unmistakably, a self-portrait of a particular kind. The artist as creature of appetite and creation, powerful and destructive, and not entirely in control of either quality. When Picasso painted Guernica in 1937, the Minotaur's shadow falls across that canvas too, in the bull figure that stands amid the bombed village's carnage. Present, uncomprehending, neither perpetrator nor mourner, but something that witnesses without being able to fully process what it witnesses. It is one of the most powerful uses of the myth in modern art, precisely because it refuses to resolve the creature into simple meaning. Jorge Luis Borges, that great Argentine librarian and fabulist, gave the Minotaur perhaps his most quietly devastating modern incarnation in a short story called The House of Asterion, published in 1947, barely 4 pages long and worth every one of them. Borges tells the story entirely from the Minotaur's perspective. Asterion, in Borges's telling, does not know he is a prisoner. He believes the Labyrinth is his palace, and that he has chosen solitude rather than having it imposed upon him. He waits, not with dread, but with a kind of patient, melancholy hope, for the Redeemer who will come and free him. The story ends with Theseus emerging from the maze and reporting to Ariadne that the Minotaur barely defended himself. She asks what the creature was like. Theseus says, "A boy." It is one of those endings that rearranges everything that came before it. The monster, seen from inside, was waiting to be saved. The hero, completing his heroic task, performed it on something that did not resist. The myth, turned inside out like a glove, shows a completely different lining. And the lining is the one that has haunted readers for nearly 80 years since. The Minotaur persists because he is the myth that contains the most questions and answers the fewest. Every other monster in the Greek tradition exists to be overcome, explained, or incorporated. The Minotaur exists to be returned to. He survives Theseus. He survives Dante. He survives Picasso and Borges, and every subsequent generation that has tried to settle the question of what he means and found, to its own recurring astonishment, that the question will not stay settled. He is born of pride and punished for existing. He is imprisoned for what he is rather than what he chose. He is killed by a hero we admire but cannot entirely exonerate. He is given a mother who named him for the stars and a darkness that was his only home. He is the creature at the center of the maze, which is to say he is the thing we find when we have traveled far enough into any sufficiently complex system, any institution, any relationship, any self, to reach what was always waiting there. Not a monster, exactly. Not a victim, exactly. Something that required 3,000 years and is not finished yet. The torches in the corridor have burned low. The thread, wherever it leads, runs back through everything we have covered. The sea-washed shores of Bronze Age Crete, the white bull rising from the water, a queen's impossible grief, an architect's terrible genius, a prince in the dark, a sleeping creature at the center of everything. Rest, Asterion. You have been patient long enough.